The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. This observation captures a fundamental tension that has shaped human existence since our species first organized into social groups. The forces that bind us together as communities, shared beliefs, common practices, collective identity, are the same forces that can crush the unique perspectives and authentic expressions that make each person irreplaceable. We find ourselves caught in a paradox. We need society to survive and thrive, yet society's very mechanisms of cohesion can systematically erode the individuality that gives life meaning and drives human progress. The question is not whether conformity pressures exist. They are woven into the fabric of social life itself, but how we can understand their operation, recognize their effects, and preserve spaces for genuine individual expression within the structures that shape our daily existence. The mechanisms through which societies shape individual behavior operate at multiple levels simultaneously, creating a web of influences so comprehensive that most people remain unaware of their operation. Social conformity is not primarily achieved through overt coercion or explicit commands, but through subtler processes that make certain thoughts, feelings, and behaviors feel natural and inevitable, while rendering alternatives invisible or unthinkable. These processes begin in earliest childhood and continue throughout life, reinforced by family structures, educational institutions, peer groups, media systems, economic arrangements, and cultural narratives that reward compliance and punish deviation from accepted norms. The result is not the conscious surrender of individual will to collective authority, but the unconscious internalization of social expectations that come to feel like personal choices and authentic preferences. The power of this system lies precisely in its invisibility. Most conformity occurs not because people are forced to comply, but because they genuinely believe they are acting according to their own freely chosen values and desires. The psychological foundations of conformity rest upon fundamental aspects of human nature that evolved to promote group survival and cooperation. Our ancestors lived in small bands where social cohesion was literally a matter of life and death. Individuals who could not integrate successfully into group structures were unlikely to survive and reproduce. This evolutionary history has left us with powerful psychological tendencies toward imitation, social learning, and the desire for acceptance and belonging. We are naturally inclined to observe what others do and modify our own behavior accordingly, to seek approval from those around us, and to experience anxiety and distress when we feel rejected or ostracized. These tendencies serve important functions in allowing human societies to coordinate complex activities and transmit cultural knowledge across generations. But they also create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by systems seeking to maintain control and prevent change. Research in social psychology has documented the remarkable extent to which individual judgment and behavior can be influenced by group pressure, even in situations where the group is obviously wrong or acting irrationally. Experimental studies have shown that people will deny the evidence of their own senses, abandon their moral principles, and engage in behaviors they find personally repugnant when subjected to subtle social pressures to conform. More troubling still, these effects occur even when the groups exerting pressure consist of strangers, with whom the individual has no ongoing relationship, and when conformity serves no apparent benefit to the individual. The implications are profound. If laboratory conditions can produce such dramatic effects, what might be the cumulative impact of lifelong exposure to conformity pressures from family, friends, colleagues, media, and institutions, whose approval and acceptance we genuinely value and need? The educational system represents perhaps the most systematic and comprehensive mechanism for producing conformity in modern societies. From the moment children enter formal schooling, they are subjected to institutional arrangements designed to produce standardized outcomes, rather than individual development. Students learn to sit in rows, raise their hands before speaking, follow rigid schedules, and compete for the approval of authority figures whose judgment determines their future opportunities. The curriculum itself, regardless of its specific content, teaches implicit lessons about what knowledge is valuable, whose perspectives matter, and what questions are worth asking. Students who challenge authority, think independently, or pursue interests that fall outside approved categories, are often labeled as problems to be corrected, rather than gifts to be nurtured. The result is the systematic suppression of curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking in favor of compliance, predictability, and the ability to reproduce predetermined answers to predetermined questions. Those who succeed in this system often do so by learning to anticipate what is expected of them and providing it efficiently, while those who fail may be precisely those whose individuality is too strong to be easily molded. Workplace environments in modern industrial societies continue and intensify these patterns through organizational structures that prioritize efficiency, predictability, and control over innovation, autonomy, and human development. Most jobs require people to subordinate their individual judgment to corporate policies, to adopt the language and values of the organization, and to suppress aspects of their personality that might interfere with smooth operations. Performance evaluation systems typically reward those who fit seamlessly into existing structures, while penalizing those who question established procedures or suggest alternative approaches. The phenomenon of corporate culture represents an explicit attempt to shape not just employee behavior but employee identity, creating environments where personal and professional selves become increasingly indistinguishable. Workers learn to internalize company values and objectives as their own, to find meaning and identity through organizational membership, and to measure their worth by their ability to contribute to collective goals that may have little connection to their individual interests or talents. The economic pressure to maintain employment adds powerful reinforcement to these conformity mechanisms, making resistance costly and alternatives difficult to envision. Media systems in contemporary societies operate as perhaps the most sophisticated conformity-producing mechanisms ever devised, shaping not just what people think, but how they think, and what they consider worth thinking about. Through the selection and framing of information, the creation of celebrity culture, and the constant reinforcement of particular lifestyle models and value systems, mass media creates what appears to be individual choice, while actually channeling behavior into predictable patterns. Advertising goes beyond promoting specific products to promoting entire worldviews based on consumption, status competition, and the endless pursuit of material satisfaction. Social media platforms amplify these effects by creating environments where individual expression is shaped by algorithms designed to maximize engagement, and where social validation becomes tied to conformity with trending opinions and behaviors. The result is a form of voluntary surveillance, where people monitor and modify their own thoughts and expressions to align with perceived social expectations, often without conscious awareness of the process. The cultural mechanisms of conformity operate through the creation and maintenance of shared narratives about what constitutes a successful, meaningful, or admirable life. These narratives become so embedded in social consciousness that they feel like natural truths, rather than historically contingent constructions. The contemporary emphasis on career achievement, material accumulation, and social status represents one such narrative that powerfully shapes individual choices by making alternatives appear unrealistic or irresponsible. Young people learn to evaluate themselves and their futures according to standardized metrics of success that may have little connection to their individual talents, interests, or values. The pressure to follow prescribed life paths, education, career, consumption, retirement, creates what might be called template living, where individual uniqueness is subordinated to social predictability. Those who attempt to forge alternative paths often face not just practical obstacles, but psychological pressure from family and peers, who have internalized these narratives and genuinely believe they are offering helpful guidance. The power of cultural narratives lies in their ability to make conformity feel like personal choice, while rendering nonconformist alternatives literally unthinkable. Religious and ideological institutions have historically played central roles in shaping conformity through the creation of comprehensive worldviews that explain existence, define moral standards, and prescribe appropriate behavior. While these institutions can provide valuable sources of meaning, community, and moral guidance, they also create powerful pressures toward orthodoxy and the suppression of questioning or dissent. The psychological comfort provided by belonging to communities with shared beliefs can make individuals reluctant to examine those beliefs critically or consider alternative perspectives. Religious and ideological conformity often operates through emotional, rather than rational mechanisms, creating deep associations between group membership and personal identity that make deviation feel like self-betrayal. The social sanctions applied to heretics, apostates, and free thinkers, ranging from shunning to persecution, reinforce these psychological pressures and demonstrate to others the costs of nonconformity. Even in secular societies, quasi-religious attitudes often develop around political ideologies, scientific paradigms, or cultural movements, creating similar dynamics of orthodoxy and suppression of dissent. The peer group represents another crucial mechanism through which conformity pressures operate, particularly during adolescence, when the need for acceptance and belonging is most acute. The desire to fit in with chosen social groups leads young people to adopt the clothing, language, interests, and values of their peers, often subordinating their individual preferences to group standards. This process continues into adulthood through professional associations, social clubs, neighborhood communities, and online groups that provide identity and belonging in exchange for conformity to group norms. The phenomenon of groupthink demonstrates how intelligent, well-intentioned individuals can make poor decisions when group loyalty overrides individual judgment. The pressure to maintain group cohesion can lead to the suppression of dissenting opinions, the dismissal of contrary evidence, and the pursuit of courses of action that serve group identity rather than rational objectives. Social media has intensified these dynamics by making peer approval and disapproval more immediate and visible, creating environments where individual expression is constantly monitored and modified in response to social feedback. The psychological costs of persistent conformity pressure can be severe, leading to what might be called conformity stress, the ongoing tension between authentic self-expression and social acceptance. Individuals who feel compelled to constantly monitor and modify their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to align with external expectations often experience anxiety, depression, and a sense of emptiness or meaninglessness. The energy required to maintain false selves and suppress authentic responses depletes psychological resources and can lead to various forms of mental and physical illness. Perhaps more troubling is the phenomenon of identity diffusion, where prolonged conformity pressure leads individuals to lose touch with their own genuine preferences, values, and interests. When external validation becomes the primary source of self-worth, people may find themselves unable to distinguish between what they actually want and what they think they should want, between their authentic responses and their learned responses. This can result in a kind of psychological homelessness, where individuals feel disconnected from themselves and unable to access their own inner wisdom and creativity. The social costs of excessive conformity extend beyond individual suffering to encompass the loss of diversity, innovation, and cultural vitality that make societies adaptable and resilient. When most people think and behave in similar ways, societies become vulnerable to collective blind spots, systemic errors, and the inability to respond creatively to new challenges. The suppression of dissent and alternative perspectives eliminates the corrective mechanisms that healthy societies need to recognize and address problems before they become crises. Innovation in science, art, technology, and social organization typically comes from individuals who are willing to challenge conventional wisdom and explore new possibilities. But excessive conformity pressure can eliminate the conditions that allow such individuals to develop and contribute their insights. The result can be social stagnation, cultural decline, and the kind of collective fragility that makes societies vulnerable to disruption by more dynamic and adaptable competitors. Historical examples abound of societies that collapsed partly because their conformity mechanisms prevented them from adapting to changing circumstances or recognizing emerging threats. Yet the challenge of preserving individuality within social structures is not simply a matter of eliminating conformity pressures. which serve important functions in allowing societies to coordinate activities and maintain cohesion. The goal is rather to achieve what might be called dynamic equilibrium between individual expression and social cooperation, creating conditions where diversity and uniqueness can flourish within frameworks of shared purpose and mutual respect. This requires developing more sophisticated understanding of when conformity serves beneficial purposes, and when it becomes destructive, when social pressure promotes healthy development, and when it inhibits human potential. The cultivation of genuine individuality, as opposed to mere rebelliousness or contrarian behavior, requires both personal development and social change, both individual courage and collective wisdom in creating institutions that support, rather than suppress, human uniqueness and creativity. The development of authentic individuality requires conscious effort to resist conformity pressures, while maintaining the capacity for healthy social connection and cooperation. This process involves what might be called discriminating nonconformity, the ability to distinguish between social expectations that serve legitimate purposes and those that merely serve systems of control, between conformity that promotes genuine cooperation and conformity that produces mindless compliance. Such discrimination requires developing strong internal reference points that can serve as alternatives to external validation, cultivating the capacity for independent thought and judgment, and learning to tolerate the anxiety and social discomfort that often accompany authentic self-expression. The goal is not antisocial behavior or automatic rejection of all social norms, but rather the development of autonomous individuals who can choose consciously when to conform and when to resist based on their own values and understanding, rather than unconscious social pressure. The cultivation of critical thinking represents one essential element in developing resistance to excessive conformity pressure. This involves learning to question assumptions, examine evidence, consider alternative perspectives, and think independently about complex issues, rather than simply adopting the opinions of authorities or peer groups. Critical thinking skills must be actively developed and regularly practiced, as they tend to atrophy under conditions of comfort and social acceptance. Educational approaches that emphasize questioning, debate, and independent research can help develop these capabilities, but they must be reinforced by ongoing practices of intellectual curiosity and the willingness to challenge one's own beliefs as well as those of others. The development of critical thinking also requires exposure to diverse perspectives and ideas, which may mean actively seeking out sources of information and viewpoints that challenge comfortable assumptions and familiar worldviews. Creative expression provides another powerful means of developing and maintaining individuality within conformist environments. Artistic activities, writing, music, visual arts, performance, crafts, allow individuals to explore and express aspects of themselves that may not fit conventional categories or social expectations. The creative process itself tends to generate novel perspectives and insights that can serve as alternatives to standard ways of thinking and being. Moreover, creative communities often provide social contexts that value originality and innovation over conformity and predictability, offering spaces where individuality can be celebrated rather than suppressed. However, creative expression must be approached with awareness that creative industries and artistic communities can develop their own forms of conformity pressure, requiring continued vigilance to maintain authentic expression rather than simply conforming to different sets of expectations. The practice of solitude and introspection plays a crucial role in maintaining contact with authentic self-knowledge and resisting the constant pressure to define oneself through external relationships and social roles. Regular periods of silence, reflection, and disconnection from social media and group activities allow individuals to hear their own thoughts and feelings without the interference of social noise. Contemplative practices such as meditation, journaling, and nature connection can help develop the capacity for inner listening that is essential for distinguishing authentic impulses from socially conditioned responses. The ability to be alone without discomfort is itself a form of resistance to social pressure, as it demonstrates that one's sense of self and worth does not depend entirely on external validation and group membership. Physical practices that challenge and develop the body can also serve as means of maintaining individuality and resistance to social pressure. Activities that require personal effort, skill development, and direct encounter with physical reality, sports, martial arts, outdoor activities, manual crafts, provide experiences that cannot be easily mediated or manipulated by social systems. These practices often involve forms of learning and accomplishment that are inherently individual, even when pursued in social contexts, and they can provide sources of confidence and self-knowledge that are relatively independent of social approval. The discipline required for physical development can also strengthen the psychological capacities needed for resisting social pressure and maintaining individual integrity in challenging situations. Intellectual and spiritual practices that connect individuals to larger sources of meaning and value beyond social convention can provide powerful alternatives to conformity pressure. Whether through philosophical study, religious practice, scientific inquiry, or other forms of truth-seeking, these practices can generate loyalties and commitments that transcend immediate social relationships and provide standards for evaluating social expectations. The key is that these practices must be pursued with genuine intellectual integrity, rather than as mere social activities or identity markers, and they must be allowed to generate insights and commitments that may conflict with prevailing social norms. The development of such practices often requires finding teachers, texts, and communities that prioritize truth-seeking over social comfort, and the willingness to follow inquiry wherever it leads rather than stopping when results become socially inconvenient. The cultivation of economic independence, to whatever degree possible, reduces vulnerability to conformity pressures that operate through economic coercion and the need for employment security. This might involve developing multiple income streams, acquiring skills that provide alternatives to conventional employment, building financial reserves that allow for greater choice in work situations, or creating businesses that allow for greater autonomy and self-direction. While complete economic independence may not be achievable for most people, even modest steps toward greater economic self-reliance can reduce the pressure to conform to workplace expectations and career paths that conflict with personal values and interests. The key insight is that economic vulnerability often forces conformity, even when individuals would prefer to act differently, making economic resilience an important component of psychological and social freedom. Building relationships with other individuals who value authenticity and independent thinking can provide social support for maintaining individuality, while still meeting basic human needs for connection and belonging. Such relationships must be based on genuine appreciation for uniqueness and diversity, rather than shared conformity to alternative norms, and they require the ability to maintain individual integrity, while also supporting others in their own authentic development. These relationships may be less common and more challenging to maintain than conventional social connections, but they provide irreplaceable sources of validation for authentic self-expression and resistance to social pressure. Communities of authentic individuals can serve as laboratories for experimenting with alternative ways of living and relating that move beyond conventional patterns of conformity and control. The practice of what might be called strategic nonconformity involves choosing carefully which social expectations to challenge and how to do so effectively. This requires understanding the difference between meaningful resistance that promotes positive change and mere rebelliousness that serves no constructive purpose. Strategic nonconformity might involve civil disobedience against unjust laws, professional whistleblowing when institutions engage in harmful practices, artistic expression that challenges social taboos, or lifestyle choices that demonstrate alternative ways of living. The key is that such resistance should be based on clear principles and aimed at specific objectives, rather than arising from general antagonism toward authority or social cooperation. Effective nonconformity often requires patience, courage, and the ability to accept personal costs for the sake of larger principles. but it can serve important functions in maintaining social health and promoting beneficial change. Educational and parenting approaches that support individual development while also teaching necessary social skills represent crucial elements in creating more balanced relationships between conformity and individuality at the societal level. This involves recognizing that children are unique individuals with their own interests, talents, and perspectives, rather than raw material to be shaped according to adult expectations. Educational environments that encourage questioning, exploration, and creative expression, while also teaching cooperation and consideration for others, can help develop individuals who are capable of both independent thinking and healthy social relationships. The challenge lies in distinguishing between necessary socialization that teaches valuable skills and destructive conditioning that suppresses individual potential. Parents and teachers who model authentic individuality, while also demonstrating respect for others, provide powerful examples of how to balance personal integrity with social responsibility.